Oh, we're late. We're supposed to have started already. I didn't notice. Welcome, everybody, to the North Dallas Developer Group. Glad you're here. It's a little weird this time because we are, of course, all dispersed, but we've had a few meetings like this. Good to see people that I've seen before. Also good to see some new folks here. So there's a chat window. I'm probably not going to be paying a great deal of attention to that. If you have questions, please in the chat channel.
Yes.
Also, please mute yourself if you are allowed. Thank you. You can put them in the Slack channel, or at any time, if you want to, you can just turn on your mic and ask a question. I don't mind being interrupted. It's totally fine. So feel free to do that anytime. Slack, I'll keep that open in another window, and I'll see any questions that come through and answer them at appropriate times. So cool. Well, today we're going to be talking about React. We're going to be talking a little bit about TypeScript. We're talking a little bit about React hooks. Other user group people, do we have any other announcements to make right now? Hey, David, who do we have speaking next month?
I don't know about next month. I have someone set up that he works at AWS, and he'll be tentatively speaking in September.
Okay, that's right. They got pushed off. Okay. We don't know who's speaking next month. We'll see. We'll, of course, let you guys know when that happens. All right, I'm going to start sharing, and we're just going to jump in unless anybody has any announcements to make. I'll take that as a no. Okay, we are not going to be building anything beautiful tonight. It's going to be very basic, and actually it's going to look somewhat like this. It's enough to show you the basics of TypeScript, React. We're going to do a little Ajax, enough to show you things without getting too complicated, I think. So what it is essentially a fantasy character creator. And so there is an API behind this that's written in Node. I'm going to be sharing the code for that and the code for the sample that we're going to be building. So that'll be on GitHub. I'll put a link up in the Slack channel for that. So this is essentially what we're going to work through, all right? And we're going to start small because this is meant for those who have never done any React before. I do assume that you've programmed things before, but I'm not going to assume that you've done any React or any TypeScript for that matter. Okay, all right, let's jump in. So I wanted to start by just creating a project, because what we're intending to do here is to really help you just get started. And so if you get started, first thing you're going to do is you're going to want to install Create React App. This is a great little NPM package. Just install Node and install this, and then you can go ahead and create React apps really easily without having to set up any sort of crazy package building scheme. I'm going to show you how easy it is. So once you have Create React App installed, and of course Node, you go to the terminal. Here we are. I have fake server here. This is the fake Node server. This is how you would create a React app right here. And this is also how you would create a React app with TypeScript. And so everything will be set up for us. We won't have to do any more of that kind of setup later. Also, and I'll go ahead and note this now because Russell is doing this for us, this is being recorded. And so this will show up on the user group's YouTube channel afterwards. So you'll be able to get the code. You'll be able to look at the videos to go back and see anything that you might have missed or whatever. So let's go ahead and get this started. Now this takes a bit because this has to download a whole lot of stuff from the internet. It doesn't take too long, but it'll take, I don't know, a minute or two. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start small. We're going to use the hello world of React apps, and we're going to create a counter. We're going to create a DOM element, and you click on that thing, and a number increments every time you click. It won't take very long, but it'll actually introduce both React and hooks fairly well to you. Then what we'll do is we'll start building our application at that point, and we'll start with the list of the characters. Well, that's running. I'll show it to you. We'll start by building this list over here on the left. We'll hard code all that data first. We'll go get all that data via an AJAX call to the server, the fake API that I've created, and then we'll create the form. And that will allow us to really work through all the basics of all of this stuff. In terms of the API, it will look something like this in terms of its data. And so we've just got names, we've got image URLs that we're going to pull off the internet, and some randomly generated IDs. It's very simple. If we go back to our terminal, we can see that it is still going. But now it's done. And so when it's done, it'll go ahead and give you some instructions. And if you look, it created a folder for me. Now, if we look at the command I executed, we did an npx create React app. That's the name of the package. And then characters, that's the folder that the app will go into. And then -- template creates it using TypeScript. So if the app is in characters, we're going to go there. And here's our app. Let's run it. The instructions say npm start. I will do that. I already have something running at the default port, so I'll just run that. And this will be what you get out of the box. So we've got image, some text, and whatnot. So let's check out this project. So by default, you've got, as you would expect for most Node projects, you've got a Node modules folder there at the root. We've also got package.json, README. You've got a TypeScript config. We're not going to pay any attention to that. Let's look real quick in the source folder and the public folder. The way this works, and this is the way React generally works, is you're going to have a web page on your website, and you're going to find a DOM element, or you're going to make a DOM element. What you're going to do is you're going to attach React to that DOM element, and React is going to do all of its work within that DOM element. Everything's going to be in there, and you don't want to change anything in there outside of React. You're going to give it complete control of that thing. And in this case, the way it generates is a div with the ID of root. Well, how does that get hooked up to the React app? Well, this is the public folder. If we go and we look in the source folder, this is where all the React stuff is. So we need something that says an ID of root. So if we look in the index.tsx, we will see right here, there is a document.getElement by ID, which goes and gets that root. And that's what attaches the app to the DOM. And how does the app get there? Well, this right here, this app comes from here, app.tsx. And this is what we actually see on the screen. It says edit to and save and reload, and I'll say OK. So here's my OK. All right. So that's what we see on the screen. Now that we've gone through that, we can ignore the public folder. We can ignore index.tsx. We are now just going to be talking about our main subject, which is how ultimately React works, and a little bit about TypeScript, and a little bit about hooks. And I'll remind you that you can at any point stop and ask any questions. You can put them in the Slack channel, or just unmute yourself and say, hey, I have a question at any point. It's all good. So I've already shown you that you can just change text, and React will go ahead and reload the app for you. This is a part of what is called the hot reload feature that's built in to create React app. And so all you got to do is make changes, go look at the browser, and you can see a really fast turnaround for everything. So right now, what you see is really just JavaScript. The only thing that's TypeScripty about what we're looking at is the .tsx extension that's on the file. Everything else is regular JavaScript, or at least you could say regular React. One thing that's not regular JavaScript, if you think about it, is this stuff. You can't normally put just HTML and stick it in your JavaScript. That's going to cause all sorts of issues. This is something about the transpiler that is building React. It's actually taking all of this HTML and turning it into JavaScript objects so it actually runs and is actually JavaScript. And that's one of the interesting things that we all know about modern JavaScript. Everything, for the most part, is written in some variation, then being transpiled into what actually gets sent to the browser. Certainly true of React. That's exactly how TypeScript works. That's how all of this is going to work. So React is an interesting combination of JavaScript, this stuff, and HTML, all in harmony, happily living together. Any questions about any of that before we move on? Well, let's see some errors while you're thinking of questions. I'm going to force some problems so we can go ahead and see what error scenarios look like. So there's a logo that was imported. We can see here that it is used. If we go and we look at our browser, we will see that it will tell us that there's a problem. And so we don't have to go and run the app and do anything special. It will go ahead and reload whenever we save, and boom, we see the error right here. We have a compilation error. So that's kind of handy. Let's put that back so we can fix it. There we go. I'm going to close that last, or get rid of that last closing div. We can also see that it will give us an error for this. Regular HTML in browsers are very forgiving in terms of making sure your HTML tags are closed. React is not very forgiving, and that's a good thing. So those are what the error screens look like. Let's go ahead and open up the console here. A lot of this stuff you'll also see here in the console. Like, let's get rid of the alt in this particular case. You will see various warnings in here. And so, as I'm sure you already do when you do web development, you probably keep your console open. It's very useful when you're doing React to do that as well. And speaking of, let's do some React. So I'm going to get rid of all of that, actually. All of that's gone. We now have a blank page. Now we do have this warning about the logo, so we don't want to forget that. Now this color comes from the app.css. The app.css file is loaded here at this point, so let's open that up. And now we're here to a blank page. So back here, this is our super cool fantasy character creator with React, TypeScript, and hooks and stuff. All right, so this is our title, which is a bit long. All right, so we've seen the basic flow of editing. Let's actually build something so we can see something substantive. Well, maybe not substantive, something more interesting in React. So here's our hello world counter example. And so what I want to do is I'm going to put a paragraph tag right here. And I want to put a counter like so. And so when we click on that, I want to see that counter go up from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 and so forth. Okay? Nothing right now does that. And so let's jump in. So how would this work? Notice when I was typing there that it went ahead and changed this import. At this point, we're using something that is called hooks. Hooks was added last year. And if you go look on the React website, I'll show it to you here. There's this section about using hooks that would walk you through it in a lot more detail than I'm going to go through. tonight. I'm going to show you the state hook and the effect hook as we do all of this. Essentially, when I think about the state hook, it's a basic replacement for something like Redux. Some people will still use Redux, but this actually works certainly in simple cases. We've got one page at work that's very complex, and we're just using this, and it actually works fine. And so some people will still want to use Redux, but in general, this is something that you can use, at least get started with whenever you're doing some React. When you use the use state hook, you can see a few different components here. One, it's a function that you import. When you call use state, you can pass in a default value. I'm passing in a default value of 0. And that's going to be, of course, the count that we have. And then what you've got over here is I'm actually pulling out both the count property and a set count function. This right here will be the value that is in state, and the set count is the function you will call to update the count. And so it might look something like this. Now you can start putting code in React, just variables and whatnot in your output HTML, just by doing something like that. So if we go look at our form, which we're no longer viewing, if we go look at our form, we see that 0. Well, let's change the default to 5 so we can see something other than 0. And there it is right there. And we can also see a warning that we are not using set count, and that is true. We're about to. So what we want to do now is we want to increment that counter. And so let's do that. Let's add an onClick. And we can put right here a function. So let's do the function out here first. So in this function, and I can just put that right there, I can say set count, like so. All right. So what this will do is this will take the current value of count, and it will just add one to it called set count. And this set count will cause the page to re-render. So we still have it defaulted to 5. So that's where it's going to start, assuming this is all correct. We can click on this, and this will now increment. Now I'm going to add a console log. So whenever I just save the page, it's going to re-render the app. And now every time I click, it's also going to re-render the app. Why it's re-rendering it twice, actually, I don't know. But it's going to re-render that app for us. The thing that causes that is this right here. Anytime you change one of the state values, what it's going to do is it's going to tell React, okay, it is time to re-render the page. There's some state that has changed. Now it's time to go figure out what has changed and then update the page. That's how React, that's essentially the model of React. Instead of, if you've done DOM programming, instead of having a variable and then to update the DOM, you go out and get the DOM element and then you manually change the text value of the DOM element, and that's how you do it. That's not how React works. It's a lot easier. What you do is you just say, here's my values. Here's my variables. Here's my state variables. And you just change those things using the appropriate methods. And what React will do is it will re-render everything and figure out how to update the page for you. It tends to be a whole lot easier, a whole lot less code to go out and grab DOM elements. I don't have to spend lots of lines of code writing, query, what is it? I haven't done DOM programming in so long. Query selector and query selector all, is that what they're called now? So long. Just been doing this kind of stuff recently. So
hey,
anyway,
Eric, quick question.
Yeah.
Do you know why it's rendering twice? Why it's saying rendering app twice?
Is this wrap?
Yeah, hey.
Hey. Actually, I don't know. And I'm wondering if it's just the TypeScript part of this. Honestly, don't know. I was surprised when I created a TypeScript app a week or two ago and saw that happening. I'm like, that's strange to me. So I don't know. It really shouldn't be that well.
Yeah, I've never seen that before either. That's interesting. Okay, thank you.
Do you ever do TypeScript?
No, I've not done TypeScript with React. I've done TypeScript with Angular, obviously, but not React.
Yeah, I don't know. I would like to know.
Okay, we'll figure it out later.
We'll figure it out later. Okay, so here's our basic counter. Every time I click, it takes the current count value, it increments it by 1, updates the state of the application, the application re-renders, the page is shown, boom, new value is shown. All right? That's the basics right there. Sure. All right, let's view source on the page. Let's increment this a few times. Okay. So if you look at here, here's our root. Now what you'll notice is that nothing of what we've done in terms of the coding, the header, the counter, any of that, nothing's on the page. And the reason why nothing's on the page is because of, well, does anybody want to answer that? Does anybody know?
I do.
Give me the answer, Doug.
So there's nothing on the page right now because React is handling putting everything on the page. So you'd have to do an inspect and see what the current state of the page is, which is what we've got right here, where what Eric is pointing out right now. Hey, it's almost like we've done this before.
It is almost. And so now when I click this, it's a really good question, right? Because as you all know, right, when you view source on a page, that's what's downloaded to the browser. That's not what happens in the browser after JavaScript makes changes to it. And so if you want to see the post changes JavaScript, you actually do have to do an inspect on the page so you can actually see that. And at least with the Chrome DevTools, you can see a little bit that it's flashing down there because that's what's changing as I hit on this counter. And so React is entirely here, entirely rendering everything in the browser. Now, there are solutions where you can render React both on the front end and the back end. Whenever I was working at One Technologies, we had a project where we did that, where it rendered on the back end and the front end. So on your initial page view, you got there and it came back with all the HTML already pre-rendered. Any subsequent changes, though, rendered on the client. And as you moved from page to page, it was still a single page app and just essentially chunks were transferred. So you can do that if you want to. I generally don't because that's a little bit more of a headache, but that's an option for you if you don't like the idea of on an initial visit to the page, you have to download everything and then have it render it before it gets viewed. So that is an option there if you're curious about that kind of thing. Good question. And yeah, somebody please keep an eye on the chat because I don't have that open at the moment. I'm sorry, could you speak up, Russell? I can't hardly hear you. Well, that's interesting.
If you run this in production mode, maybe it won't do that.
Yeah. That's a good, that's something if we have time later, we'll do. Yeah, see if that fixes it. For right now, though, it's not something we need to worry about. In production, you definitely don't want too many renders. That can slow things down. If there's a few too many renders, it's not usually a problem. If there's lots and lots of extra renders, it definitely can be. So certainly something to look into. And then maybe we will later. Thank you for that note. Any other questions? No? Okay. I want to show you one other thing. And this gets to the next part of hooks. And so we just used the state hook. So if you go look at their documentation, they do a clicker. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to use the use effect hook as well. And that's the next one there that you can go read about. What does that do? What the use effect hook does is it essentially sets up a side effect. So whenever state changes, it'll run, at least potentially. Okay. So this is what it looks like. Now it's squigglied there. Why is it squiggled? Because we actually have to bring it in, like so. And so what happens here is whenever you do a set count, that's going to cause the function to re-render, and that's going to fire off the use effect. And so what it will do in this case is it'll update the document title with all of this. So let's give that a try. Okay, so it's already done it. We've got that. You clicked 5 times, and so as we click, you can see that it increments as well. And you can really do anything in these use effects. It's sometimes you might want to actually chain functions, and so whenever someone clicks, you have 7 things you want to do, and so you chain all of those so you make sure all of those happen. You can also use this to decompose and just react in certain situations, so you can split things up a little bit. I think that's probably something of a judgment call. There's a number of use cases for it. We're going to actually use it again at least once later in this presentation. So here's our 2 hooks. Use state. What this does is this gives you a state store, a variable store for you to put data in. And React will keep track of your data, and you can change it just by calling the function that comes out of use state, like so. And then the other hook, when all of this is built into React now, this is unlike Redux, it's not something you have to download and through npm and set it up separately. This just comes with React. Use state is for managing state. Use effect, think of it as it's a side effect. It is use effect. It's something that happens whenever state changes. All right, so that's our basic counter. Now, something that you're going to do in React apps is you're not going to want to put everything in your app in app.javascript, app.jsx, or app.tsx. So let's go through the process of breaking this out into a separate component. So what would that look like? Well, let's go to the source directory. I'm going to create a new file. I think this might be our first new file. What do we need? For a very basic component to just get things running, you need this. You need this to get the React bits in. What else do we need? We need a function. Okay. Let me mute the channel so I don't get notifications. There we go. All right, back to it. So what you need is you need a function, and this function needs to return essentially some HTML. So like so. Now these parentheses aren't strictly necessary. I always use them because it's essentially my delimiter for where the main DOM of the function is. It's a really common thing that you'll see. And finally, you need to export the function because otherwise nobody can get access to it. So now that we've created this basic component, let's go here and let's include it. You don't actually need the .tsx there. You can just reference the file name. And then, once you've brought that component in, you just bring it down here and you just turn it into an HTML element, and well, that's all you need to do. So the counter would go there. So now that we have the basic component, let's extract everything from the upper level app component and pull it down. So what do we need? We need the state. Now, state, sometimes you'll want state in higher level components. Sometimes you'll want them in lower level components. It's really all about who needs that data. No one's going to use the count variable other than the counter, so we're going to take it. We're also going to need the function for handling the click. And we're going to need to use this because this uses the count variable, so we'll need to take that out. Go in here and just put this before we return in the HTML. Now, use state and use effect are no longer present with us. So Voila, that brings that in. Now, of course, the very complicated part of the DOM here. Now let's see if it all still works. Counter, incrementing, title, incrementing. We have successfully extracted that. Now, all that's in app is the import for counter, and then putting counter into the output. And this is one of the things I like the most about React, is I love its ability, or your ability to, with React, to break an app down into composable pieces. And so if there's anything that I think is too big within a particular component, I can just take it out to simplify things, to just make my code file smaller. This is all I have to do. Turn it into a component and move it out. It's pretty easy and super nice. Any thoughts? Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow?
There are a couple of questions in the chat.
In Slack, there's a question about Visual Studio. This is VS Code on a Mac. You can get it on Windows as well. Or are you talking about the Zoom chat?
Yeah, there's actually one in Zoom chat where they're asking about using the difference between using functions or classes. Which one is better?
Okay, so
for your React.
All right, yeah. Let me look through it real quick. Okay, so from what I understand, you actually can't use hooks with React classes. I believe it's a sign that they're wanting to go away from them. But I believe I read that you don't and you can't use hooks with those. That is correct. Thank you, Bob. So that's why I'm using functions here. And one of the things that you had with React classes that you had more like lifecycle. I don't want to say hooks. That's the wrong word because hooks is not something else. Lifecycle methods you could use, you could implement and put code in. You've got different ways of doing that now with hooks. And so it's not made for classes. It is really just made for functions. Now, classes are still supported. If you upgrade your version of React, assuming your stuff isn't too old, it should still work. Because classes are still there and are still supported. You just can't use hooks. Good question. Okay, so now let's start making our character app. I want to do a little CSS though, because I really hate it when things are like jammed up against the wall there. And so let's go do a little CSS. And so we have a class name of app here. Notice the DOM element, for those of you who've done HTML and CSS, this probably stuck out to you immediately. Notice it says class name here instead of class. And I believe the reason why is because class is actually a keyword in JavaScript. So sure would make it a lot easier to parser if they just name it class name. So they did. So here we go. I'm going to set a max width on this to 960 pixels, which means if it gets smaller, it will still shrink. But this will at least constrain the width of it. And I'm going to margin 20 pixels, top and bottom, and auto. And that will give us a nice centered look. All right. So that's better. So now let's go ahead and start building the character thing. So first we're going to build the list. All right. So let's start doing that in the app component. And this time we're going to continue to build in the app component, and then we will extract out of that. When we make our next component after this, we'll just start with it separated. But it's a good practice to see components being refactored and extracted from other components. And so we're going to go ahead and do that. So what do we need to do? Well, let's think about the application. Here it is, this beautiful, beautiful application. So what do we have? We probably have a DOM element, right? All DOM elements are square. We've got this square here that stuff's going to go into. And then inside of that, we have some sort of list. Now we could actually use an unordered list or an ordered list here. That would be totally fine. Or we could just have some divs that are stacked on top of each other. All that's fine. And then within those, you've got, of course, the image for a character, and you've got the name for that character. And the form we're going to build will have those two inputs for those things. So image name in a box. So let's build that. To keep it simple, what we're going to do is we're going to hard code the data. And then later on, we'll come and actually get it from the API. Because we want to keep this as simple as possible. So let's do this. So let's create some characters. Start off with an array, ID of 1. Somebody give me a good fantasy character name.
Trogdor the Burninator.
Trogdor the Burninator.
Trogdor. T-R-O-G.
Trogdor, yeah. Okay. Okay. Would that be B-U-R-N-I or B-U-R-N-A?
You spelled it right.
Yeah, sweet. All right, and so we need a image URL. And so I'm going to go here. We'll pick this guy. Copy image address. Boom. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to take that character and we want to render that on the page. All right, here's our data as if we pulled it from an API. So we want to render it down here. So let's do it. Well, let's go ahead and create an outer DOM element to wrap the whole component in, or what will later be a component. So everything is going to go in here. Now, how do I take that data and get into React components? Well, outside of this, we could build some stuff here. It was a little, it took me a little bit of getting used to for this whenever I saw it. But what I'll often do and what I often see is what you'll do is you just do something like this. You'll do characters, right? Because it has access to that variable. And characters is an array. And so arrays come with a map function. And so what a map function does is it will go one by one through an array, and it will essentially iterate over it. And then whatever you return out of the function becomes the replacement in the new array that comes out. So if you have 5 elements going in, you're going to have 5 elements going out. And so we have 5 JavaScript objects going in. We want 5 DOM elements coming out. So we have a function here. And as long as we just return a DOM element, we should be fine. And, oh, not hi. Hi is not a valid HTML element. Silly. All right, let's go back to our app. Here it is. Here's our hi. All right, so that worked. All right, well, let's see if this map actually works. Let's create another character. I need another name. All right, I'll make it up. It is the Chris Bernardinator.
It's Bernard.
Ben, will you still be my friend?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thank you. All right, let's pick, there's one down here I saw that works pretty well. Oh, here it is. All right. This is you now. So now when we go back, we should see 2 highs, right? Because there's 2 elements, 2 objects in the array. We're going to map And so it's creating one div with high in it for each one. So let's actually output something. So, all right, so if we want to switch from HTML into JavaScript, we can do this. And now we get Trogdor the Burninator and Chris the Bernardinator. All right. Now let's jump over to the console for some groovy logs. All right. Now we've got some yellows and some reds. The yellows are easy. Use state and use effect. They're defined but not used. That's because we refactored all of our previous component out. So let's just go ahead and remove that so we can get rid of them. We're going to use them again here in a minute, but that should at least get rid of those warnings. But what about, do I have to refresh for that? There we go. What about the unique key prop? Well, think of it this way. When React has to take a list of items and put that on the page through a map like this, what it needs is it needs a way of keeping track of which one is which. And so it expects you to put a key prop on. And what that looks like is just simply something like this. And so we have an ID here. Oh, I got to do character.id. Like, before I do that, let's go look at that error, because I totally just created one. I can see the error both in the page and in my console. And in both cases, it's pointing to the same place, obviously. Where in the world does ID come from? Well, it comes from here. And I had to refresh earlier because it didn't pick up a warning. You will sometimes have situations where when it tries to hot reload it, or it'll just stop hot reloading after certain errors. That seems to be fairly rare. When that happens, just refresh. And if the error is still there, then you still haven't fixed it. In this case, I didn't have to refresh. It just did it for me. So now I've got no errors. I've got no warnings. I have this. What I don't have now is I still don't have the image. So let's do this. Let's wrap name in a span. Now notice, while we're doing this, we still have not seen any TypeScript. All of this is just plain old JavaScript. We will see it in a few minutes. All right, image source. Well, how do we get that? Character image URL. All right, if you do this, it will give us a warning saying, hey, your images need an alt. Okay. I will use the character.name. Here we go. All right, you know what? I'm just going to ignore this cookie thing. But we do see our images. We see Trogdor, the Burninator, and Chris, Bernardinator. We see our images. Now that's really terrible because, as you can see, they're huge. So let's go back to at here. We can say this was, what do we call that? Character list. So this right here will target, here's our CSS selector review. This right here will target the character list as a whole. If I want to, for example, grab all of the images inside that, this will just find all images anywhere in the DOM tree underneath character list. And I can give it a max height of 50 pixels. And so forth. Okay? Sweet. That worked just fine. Now, I can also, if we wanted to, we could bring in some flexbox and we could space this out a little bit. I guess let's just do it. Now, if I want to get, if we go review where we're at, we've got a div. This is the character list that we're referencing. There's some divs that are immediate children of that. So let's do character list, div, and display flex. Okay. And so now, and I guess, that really didn't give us anything right now. Let's skip that. We don't need it. We're not making an app for beauty. We're talking about React. Okay, so where were we? Okay, so we've got all this now. This all works in terms of rendering. We've done some very basic styling. What are we going to do? Well, let's talk about how we would TypeScript this thing. So we can see here, right, these are just JavaScript objects. When we go down here, if we hover over things, we can see that it is already inferring that these are strings. One thing I'd like to do is I would like to explicitly jump into TypeScript, and let's actually create a character. So I'm going to do a new file. Now, TypeScript, you'll typically use .ts. TSX is for the React files, the ones that will actually have the DOM stuck in. If you're just doing plain TypeScript, you can just do this. And so what's this going to look like? And so, you know, if you've TypeScript, as a very, very brief introduction, essentially what TypeScript is, it is a strongly typed language that is compiled down to JavaScript, which is not a strongly typed language. So if you like the benefits of strong typing, which can sometimes be better in IntelliSense, or the compiler checking errors for you, then something like TypeScript can be super useful. If you've done C#, it might feel somewhat familiar. It's a nice, seems like a nice mix between JavaScript and C#. All right, class character, and so we don't forget later. Okay. So we've got our character, it has no properties or anything, but we've exported it so we can use it. Let's go ahead and generate some problems. I mean, some properties is what I really mean. Unlike JavaScript, what we're doing here is we're actually specifying for these properties. We're actually specifying what type they're going to be. So ID is going to be a number, name is going to be a string, and image URL is going to be a string. Now, this is not a syntax error, I don't believe. What this is it's telling you that telling me that I've created a property, but I don't have anything that definitely assigns a value to it. And who doesn't like to have undefined scattered everywhere? Well, I don't. And so what this will do is this will basically tell you from a compiler standpoint, this is potentially bad, right? This is potentially bad. There's not that you can have a character at this point that has no values assigned for these things. And so, okay, we're going to fix that. But before we do, let's jump back here to the app. Now, sometimes we've seen the errors in the console. Sometimes we've seen them here. This is just the IDE, or this is just the editor giving me a warning. Let's go ahead and include this TypeScript character into the app, and let's see what happens. So now I've pulled it in from that file. Now bad things have happened, or if you look at it the way TypeScript wants you to look at it, good things have happened. Because now TypeScript is putting it in your face that, hey, you have an issue. We don't want nullable things on accident. If you want nullable things, fine. Just make it on purpose. This looks like an accident. I'm not compiling. Deal with it, dude. And so we can see that here. And so that's great. So let's go deal with it. What would you do in this particular case? Well, what you can do is you can create a constructor. And then you say this .id, ID. Now that we've done that one, this one is no longer underlined. So now we have TypeScript keeping us from doing something that we probably should have done anyway. So now that that's saved, this is throwing an error. If we refresh again, did I actually save it? ID has no initializer. It's not definitely assigned in the constructor. Yes, it is. Okay, so here it is. There's that same error. Let's kill it. Start it again. and then we should be fine. This is the thing I told you about sometimes you have to stop and restart it. Well, here we go. All right. So now we've got classes, and I, of course, am definitely wondering why that image is broken there. But before I move on, let me look at the questions, because I see there's some in the chat. Did you have to install any extensions to get TSX files to work in VS Code? If I recall correctly, whenever I first encountered a TypeScript file, VS Code prompted me and said, hey, do you want to download stuff? That's typically what it tends to do when you use languages for the first time. So there's an answer to that one. Yeah, all right, so that's it. So you'll probably get prompted. If not, you can go look up the extensions. But if I recall correctly, I didn't have to look it up. It was just something that was automatically there. Okay, character is defined but never used. That is true. We have, in fact, brought in character, but we haven't used it here or below. So let's do it. So now we get our nice IntelliSense about what we're expecting. We're expecting a 1, and then we're expecting a name, and then a URL, an image. Now, the missing image that we were just seeing, I'm wondering if someone's noticing that this image is being requested cross-domain and is blocking me.
I don't think that's what it is, Eric. I think it's you right-click the Google preview of it instead of the one from the site that it was pulling from. So it's a signed image that expired, probably.
Ah, thank you. Well, then let's go get a, well, now it's working. All right, if it happens again, we can just go ahead and actually go to the raw image and get the URL from that. All right, so now we have characters, all right? And so when we have characters and we go down here, obviously we're still going to get these, a little bit of IntelliSense about things. I mean, one of the advantages of this is you're not, if you're using a language like JavaScript that is not type safe, then the parser has to do a lot of extra work to figure out what the types are. But if you're using something like TypeScript, you're generally going to get better type hinting and you're going to get better IntelliSense. And so in this case, it doesn't really matter. What we're about to do is we are about to extract all of this out of this component, and we're going to see something that I think is really nice about TypeScript. So let's do it. Let's create this new file. This is going to be character list. Let's see, import React from React. Like I said earlier, whenever we do this, for our next component, we'll start with it extracted so we don't have to go through this again. But this is good practice. So we have our character list. Stuff goes here. And whenever I'm refactoring, what I always do is I always do something really simple like this. Not class, function. I do something very simple like this. I'm not going to bring in any of the code, because what I'm going to first do is make sure everything's spelled correctly and all that and get it into the page. And then I'll move the stuff. You know, baby steps. It's like debugging. Don't change a lot of things at the same time. Change one thing at a time in the test. Character list. Same principle. So character list, let's put it right under counter. All right, there's our stuff. Now that we know that the separate component works and we can import it, let's start bringing things out. Here's that. All right, I said if this happened again, we would go get a new image. So let's do it. Open image, a new tab. Oops, still more there. All right, there it is. Okay, now that our image is back, let's start refactoring and let's see some more errors, because who doesn't like seeing them? Let's start with, first of all, let's take the characters out. Actually, let's leave those there. You'll see why in a second. Let's take the component out. So if we pull this whole thing out, we pull all of that out. We're going to pull it. I don't think we'll see any errors at this point. All of our data is just completely gone. Now we're going to put this in. All right. So what now is going on? Well, first of all, we no longer have characters, right? This kind of makes sense. We've now moved all the code that used the characters out of scope. The characters variable is defined up here in this scope. And as we can see, it's no longer being used. But if we look at, there's this zoom bar. I need to move out of my way. There it is. Okay, so now if we go back to character list, all right? So characters is out there, but characters needs to be in here. So what do? Well, this is, we're going to use something called props that you use in React. It's really, really common in React for you to have state in a component and then to pass that state into lower components. And what you can do with this kind of pattern is, for example, is you can have some components that their entire job is just rendering beautiful UI. That they don't do any sort of API calls, any sort of complicated logic. All they do is render. In this case, we might have some complicated logic in there in a minute. We may or may not, who knows? But right now, it's just a UI component, and we need to send our data down into it. And so the normal way you would do this in React is by doing this. And this, from a React standpoint, would actually be entirely fine and normal. This is something that TypeScript is going to impose on you. And so what TypeScript, because it is a more type-safe language, what it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, if you want to pass a component in, then you need to define it, right? Imagine for you C# people out there, if you have some class that's not a dynamic class, and you just assign a property to it that doesn't exist on the class or any of the classes it inherits from, you're going to get an error because it's not expected. That's what's going on here. We have a character list component. I haven't defined that it takes anything like characters anywhere. So it's giving me an error and says, hey, please fix this. So let's fix this. And once again, this is TypeScript specific. This is not React specific. So how does this work? Well, let's do this. So I'm going to create an interface. And what this interface will do is it will define anything that's going to come into character list. So like, for example, I can say characters. And what is characters? It is an array of type character. Now notice it went ahead and imported it there because I used it. Thank you, editor. So now I have props here, this interface. Now I can do this. So props is the React term for this kind of thing. This is not a TypeScript thing. This is a React thing. You've got props. These are these properties that you pass into a component. This right here says these, whatever comes in is of type props, and whatever is type props, it has characters to it. So I can do this. And at this point, it's going to get the characters that come in as properties, and it's going to map over them like before. I'm going to save this. If we look at app.tsx, we can now see it's no longer squiggly, all right? And we can now see that this works again. Okay, so that was a lot. Let me repeat basically what's going on here. In React, you can pass down arbitrary things. That's no problem. React is totally cool with that because it's JavaScript. It's a dynamic language. TypeScript is not cool with that. TypeScript says, no, you're going to define this. And so if we wanted that to be allowed, we could bring it in up here and say arbitrary is of type string, and therefore it would be allowed. Now let's just go and do it. So now if we go back, we can see that it is now allowed. Now I'm going to do another thing. Okay. Notice character list here now has an underline. Why does it have an underline? Where it says property arbitrary is missing the type characters. That's not right. Is missing in arbitrary is missing in type, and there's the type definition. It still has characters in it. What's going on here? It's like the opposite of what we had. By specifying the props, we not only define what can come in, but also what must come in. And I do kind of like this. But it doesn't, you're not stuck though. You can actually just make something nullable. All right, and that's a way of triggering and telling TypeScript that it's not actually required. And so you can have a mixture of some things are required and some things are not, which is quite normal in object-oriented programming. All right, well, I don't need that property, so I'm going to get rid of that. Now, I'm going to open it up for questions here in just a second. I'm going to do one last thing before I do that. So get your question ready if you have it. And that is, this is not normally what people do. All right, this is not normally what people do. Well, they'll generally do this. What that is instead of actually using the prop variable and having to use that everywhere inside the code of the component, is we'll go ahead and destructure the object, or the object here. We're going to destructure it and pull up characters out as an independent variable. And so you don't have props dot, props dot, props dot, props dot all over the place in your component if you have multiple values coming in. And so this is going to really be your normal pattern. You're going to, in regular React without TypeScript, you're going to see this destructuring. This is going to be normal. You're also, I think, going to see it in TypeScript as well. It's a really nice convenience. Okay. So now we've created our character list with hard-coded data. We've seen some errors. We've seen this interface props thing. Now, anybody have any questions before we move on? Feel free to speak up if you want to, or you can put it in the chat.
I have a question about the state management.
Go for it.
I was just wondering how you know what changed when you get the list of changes. So when you had the use state, how do you know what changed in there in case you need just to know what was dirty when you're updating your user interface?
You actually don't have to think about it. You just change the state. Well, the way React works is you have data and you specify declaratively, I want the page to look like this, all right? What happens is when React runs, whenever a change is made, what it will do is it will re-render the component or components with the new data that you have, all right? So it's got this, it's what they call, it's a virtual DOM. It's got this representation of the DOM in memory. It will compare that to what is in the DOM on the page. And then if there's any diffs, it will make those changes for you. So you actually don't have to think about which elements, like if you are deleting something out of a list, you don't actually have to think about, okay, which one was actually deleted. I have to know that he picked 5 out, so I, the 5th thing out of a list, so I can go and remove that out of the DOM. You actually don't have to do that with React because it will just re-render, compare, and make that change. And so it's just a very different way of dealing with keeping the DOM up to date with what your state is. You just change the state, and it will generally figure out how to do that, do the diff and do the mapping for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I have a question about the CSS as well, but I'll let other people ask something
Okay.
first.
We'll come right back to it then. Do TSS, this is from Clem. Thanks for coming, Karan. Do TSX files get large due to page HTML, or are you able to break up a page? Yeah, actually, I very much avoid large files, and this is a TypeScript thing as much as it is a React thing. It's actually not about TypeScript; it's just React files, and that is whenever I see a React file getting too large, what I'll do is I'll break it out into separate components. I'll do exactly what we did with character list and with counter, is I will tend not to create lots of extra components at first. I will tend to create them in other things, and then as I'm feeling I want this in a separate component, it's really at that point that I start extracting things out. And so you can have a very large complex page broken up into lots of really small components. And as long as the JavaScript you're using isn't using any hooks or isn't involved in rendering, you can also take just plain old JavaScript functions out and move them into other files as well and import them and use them. So it's actually, this is one of the great things about React. It's got this great component model, and it allows you to break things into as small of pieces as you want so that you can keep things nice and modular. So yeah, you can very easily with React avoid large JSX or TSX files. Back to the CSS, Chris.
Okay, my other question was, you have class name and you said it's basically an analog to the HTML class.
Yep.
And I saw that you put the CSS for those classes in app.css.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've seen in other tutorials where they had, like in the same TSX, they had styling along with the stuff, which that didn't seem great to me. But are you able to separate it out per component? Like, could you have a character.css, and then how does that scoping work in the actual DOM? Does it prefix or add dashes between like the hierarchy, or how is that resolved? Because I assume that you could have clashes of classes where you wouldn't necessarily want those to be the same style.
It is not, from what I understand. I've never seen it do that. I've never seen it where it changes your CSS for you. But what is going to happen is, if you have some conditional rendering, for example, that doesn't bring in character list, and I do what I'm doing right here, and I have character list where I import character, well, I think I did that right. And so if you have some conditional rendering, which we'll see here in a minute, and you don't include character list, it also shouldn't include the CSS that goes along with it. And so that's how you can avoid some pollution. But honestly, I would still go with the same old CSS rules that have always applied, and just use appropriate selectors and scoping in CSS, just in case you get some sort of conflicts. So I would, in that sense, I would treat it just like regular CSS.
So when you do your styling for an actual app, are you doing all of your styling at a global level, or are you actually doing per component styling in per component CSS files?
Generally per component CSS files. I am also not a huge fan of a lot of styling in the actual code itself. Let me show everybody how that would work. So let's say you wanted to add some style to this span. You can do inline styling and it would look like this. Okay, so I can come up here and I can create an object, and you can do, I'll do color first because that's really easy, right? Here's an object. I put it right there, and so it should be red over there, and it is. The way it works, though, is you can't do something like, what's a good one? Border. You can't do this. This is not valid JavaScript. And so you'll see something like border top. I'm assuming you can put a border on the top of a span, yeah. That's no problem. So that is an option, and some people love this. And the benefit of doing this styling, and this is when I would use something like this for sure, is if you have a conditional, all right, where you can have something like let styles equals a blank thing, but if, you know, something is true, think of it, you could have it as validation rules or something like that. You can then change the styling on the fly based on the state of the application and have it apply. You could also do the same thing with the class name. Just change the class name, have multiple class names. A lot of it's preference. From the very small sampling of React developers I know in person, live in the flesh, they really seem to like this object-based styling. I'll leave that there for reference. But it's not my favorite. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thanks.
Sweet. Trogdor. Nice.
Yeah.
Nice background.
He's the Burninator.
All right. So let's see. Where were we? We've factored the code. We've taken it out of the app component. We brought it down to here. Shown you how the props work. I think we're done right here. So let's now actually talk to our API. So instead of having hard-coded stuff, let's do that. Now let's look at the API code real quick. It is super, super complex and special. So it is this one file. This is an Express site. It works like this. App.use here allows you to receive JSON stuff in the body posts. That's what that line does. What this does is get you around any CORS issues. And here is my database, just an array in memory, and I'm going to put stuff in there, which means if I want to clear out the data, all I have to do is restart the server, and it's cleared out. So this is, this is a fake API. Now there's two functions that matter. There's the get for characters, and what it will do is it will send the characters back to the client. I am putting a 2-second delay on this and the post so that we can, in a bit, depending on time, put some logic in for conditional rendering to show that something's loading. So that's actually what that's there for. Whenever you post, it's going to get the request body. There's the character. Oh, we haven't done this yet, but we'll get there. It's going to generate an automatic ID. Yes, I know that's, you can get ID collisions. Don't care. It's a test API. It's going to push that onto the characters array that is right there. And then it's going to return a 200. And so the front-end app will have to go back and request and do a get to get the characters. All right, so that's the entirety of the API. There's this message if you go to the root if you want to. And down here it says, hey, listen to the port. Which port? Well, the one that's defined up here. There is a very simple Express website. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to pull that data. All right, so how's that going to work? Well, if you haven't used Fetch, the JavaScript API for doing Ajax, I'm going to show you that here in a second. First of all, let's turn this away from a hard-coded array into actual state. So now, earlier we were using use state here, and then we got rid of it. Now we're going to bring it back. Now I'm going to do something fun. I'm going to say whatever is in here is, in fact, a character, which I can do in TypeScript, which I cannot do in just plain old React. All right, so here's characters. It's no longer this hard-coded list. Characters is now getting passed into here. If we go back here, we see now all of our data is gone. Why is it gone? Well, it's a blank array now. Set characters is not used yet. That is true. we have actually not gone and got that data. Now, what I want to do, but I'm not going to do right now, is I want to do whenever page loads, go get that data. But I'm not going to do that yet because then I have to explain something about use effect that I want to keep till later. So I'm going to, you'll see when we get there. I'm going to add a button here. I'm going to say load data. Okay. So on this button, I'm going to click. And when we click on that, what we're going to do is we're going to run a function. So I'm going to define that function. Load the data. So basically like that, all right? So that is where we have to load our data. So let me go get that snippet. So I don't have to sit there and type it in front of you and make you watch me. What is going on? Well, what we have is we have a fetch to the get method. And I'm going to get the response back, turn it to JSON. Hey, here's the JSON. And I am going to set the characters value. And so that will update the state. And assuming everything's working, when the state gets updated, then this characters is going to get passed down into character list and everything's going to render. So assuming everything works fine. Now I've got a 2-second delay on it, but I can see that, oh snap, another one of my image URLs from earlier has been destroyed. Well, that's really sad. We'll fix that in a minute whenever we create new characters. These are ones that were sitting in the API already. We'll deal with that in a minute. But we can see at this point that loading ultimately works. Now, let me refresh. You probably notice when I click, there is a delay, and that is because of the delay I put in the server, all right? So now we've actually loaded that data. Any questions at this point? Any questions about fetch? Any questions about any of the changes we just made? No? Okay. Let's go ahead and create our character form so we can get some better data in there. And most of this I am going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to be pasting in most of this, just because it is already 7:50. So let me just go get my sample, and I'll paste this in piece by piece. So I'm definitely going to need React, right? Well, let's go ahead and start our function. Like so. And let's go ahead and default our function. Like so. We, of course, need to return some Groovy DOM elements. So this will be the div right there. So now let me get that form to speed this up for you. So this is what the form is going to look like when we don't have much of anything implemented. Okay? And so we're going to have labels and we're going to have inputs. And maybe I won't even add in the styling. Export default down here. That would have been an error. Maybe I won't even put in the styling to make this look good because, well, it's not going to even look good at the end. But we are going to run short on time. So let me import this and import character form from well, you got to type things in the right order. So here's character form. Let's go ahead and include that here. All right, cool. So this has to do with our form, which we haven't implemented. We'll get to it here in a second. So we have inputs and we have buttons. What's the next thing? Well, what I want to do is I want to be able to change stuff, right? I want to be able to type things here. I want to be able to type things there and things show up. Right now, nothing shows up. And the reason why nothing shows up is because I haven't set up any of the state mechanism for the components. Let's do it. I'm in the wrong file. Here we go. So we have name and we have image URL. Make sense? That's what's going to show up down here. And so for value for input, that's going to end up being name. And this is going to end up being image URL. Now, if we go back and we start typing, we're going to see that it still doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is what we have to do is we have to attach some on-change event handlers. And so we do something like this. On-change. Instead of taking these functions and putting them out, I'm just going to do them inline. This, if you're familiar with DOM programming, this is the event object that similar to what you normally see. And so what I want to do is, this is the name. So I'm going to set the name. So I'm going to say set name. And what do I want? I want the events.target.value. Right? And every time I type there, it is actually updating state for me. And so I don't have to worry about whether this is going to have the right value in name when I use it. It actually will. It will have that value, and we'll see that here in a second. Oops. So let's bring this down here. I'm no longer going to be setting name. I'm going to be setting image URL. So now I have two things that work at this point. Now what do I want to do? Well, whenever someone clicks on this, I want to do something. So I'm going to create a function called complete form. It's going to be right here. And so I'm going to start with just calling another function. And we'll see what happens. Well, that function doesn't exist. Well, good news. It does actually exist. So let's take a second and talk through this. Okay? That is something we will need here in just a second. So this is fetching just like the other. Some differences though. One, we're actually specifying the method. We're going to make it a post. And we're going to be sending things over as application JSON. And so for the body, I'm going to stringify this object. I'm creating an object on the fly using these two state values, like so. And so this is going to turn into a JSON blob, a JSON string. And that's going to be sent over the wire to the server. All right. And then when that's done, then in a minute, we're going to refresh the data. But we're not going to do that yet. So let's do this. I am going to use our previous URLs because we know those work now. Now, I think I've probably sent it to the server correctly. I think. Options and post. I got a 200 back, so it should still be there. So now it should be there now. So let's load the data and see if all three show up. Oh, they do. And look, our image that mysteriously disappears sometimes is there. Sometimes. So now we have successfully actually gone and sent data to the server. All right. Now, this scenario I wanted to show you because what happens when you have a scenario where you have a component and two components that are sibling components within another. And by that, I mean, you have app.tsx. It has character list and character form are sibling components. And if character form does something, and character list needs to know about it, well, they're siblings. Character form should not be talking directly to character list. How do you do something like this? And at least one very easy way of doing this, without setting up some sort of a event-based system or anything like that, is to do something like this. actually, forget that. I'm just going to pass this function in. If I take this into character form, we haven't done this yet. No, we haven't really done this in terms of our custom components. You can pass functions down just as easily as you can pass variables. Now, we'll get a squiggly here. We'll have to think back and go, why are we getting squigglies here? Did Eric do something wrong? Well, sort of. Eric did something wrong. But this is expected. So I'm going to save that. We'll get an error over there. All cool. We go to character form and we remember, aha, TypeScript requires that you define an interface. So for the props. So I now have to, because it does take props, I have to define this. And so it looks something like this. You can, at this point, what do we call it here? We call it load the data. We'll just stick with that. Load the data. And so what do? You say this right here tells it it's a function. And then this right here says that it returns void. So now we can bring this in as props here, like so, and we can use it. So now what should happen, if everything is good, is after the post finishes, it should trigger a call to go fetch the data again. And so what will happen here is this will fire, that is here. This will cause a fetch. The data will come back. When the data comes back, it'll change the state. And when the state changes, it will reload the character data. So let's add our next person. Chris makes it back into the app. It's very important. Okay, so this should take 2 seconds. And then the load should start, and that'll take 2 seconds. And then we now have, now this thread is mysteriously disappearing because of our same image URL issue. But we do see we have all 4 characters at this point. Okay. So this is one way of handling nesting of components. All right. You don't want character list because it's a sibling to know anything about character form. And you don't want character form to know anything about character list. So basically what you do is you use the parent. And you have the parent, essentially it's passing in a callback down. All right. That's the basic idea of this pattern. It's really easy to do. And as long as you don't do it too much, it doesn't get too complicated. Any questions about any of that?
I have a question. Sorry.
No problem.
Is there a better way to do that where you just have? I'm trying to think something like MVVM, where you're able to just observe the changes in the child there and app. Like, is there any way to have like an I command that is executed, or is that pretty much what you have to do is create your own each time with a passing in what's effectively a delegate for a method to call on the parent?
No, you don't have to. What you can do, and like what I used to do in Redux world, is they had a provider component that you could use that you could wrap around in the entire React tree. And what you could do is access any particular state values in there, which was really handy. But one of the net effects of that was also that you could change the state at any point in the application, which would then trigger for the whole application to re-render, which is actually really fast. So that's actually not bad. If you're not used to it, it's actually not bad. It would cause it to re-render. And so basically you just change the state in character form. And then the whole thing would re-render, character list would see new data and do something about it. So that would be one way of doing it. You could also build just a plain event-based system because you can use the use effect, which we have in Counter. You could use the use effect to subscribe and unsubscribe to things that are event-based. And if you look at, and if that sounds weird, if you look in the use effect hook documentation, I think it's in here. And for whoever's asking about the class question earlier, they explicitly contrast use effect in classes in functions versus what you would do in classes. Effects with cleanup. Imagine like this, which I assume you can see on my screen, where this is for like chatting with a chat API and doing some subscriptions. You know, I can imagine like WebSocket subscription this way. You could hook up into an event-based system there and do it that way if you wanted to completely decouple things, because passing too many callbacks around is very annoying. So yeah, if you had to do it too much, eventually you'd give up and you'd go, no, this is terrible. I have to reach outside of this and just go to some sort of event-based system, or go the more Redux pattern that I did like 2 years ago. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out I know it's a simple app, but I just didn't like how the API calls are done in two different places. Like, you know, you're doing the get in the parent, and then you're doing the post in the child. So I was trying to think about how that would be refactored to kind of have like a single controller that handles the API service.
Well, if that's what you want to do, all you really have to do at that point is just create another JavaScript file that has like an object with two functions on it, one for load data and one for sending data. And you can use that and share that in different components. Of course, then you're still going to be using either callbacks or promises or something whenever you're calling those, because you can't use, from what I understand, you cannot use the hook functions outside of actual React components. But that would be something you could pull out that way as well.
Cool.
It's you know, it's the great thing about there's so many options, right? It's also the negative of there's so many options. And so you have to go through that decision of, wait a minute, which way am I going to solve this particular thing? And I'm not sure there is a way. There are just ways that various people do it. And you just have to decide what you like. Generally speaking, React tends to be less prescriptive than lots of other frameworks in terms of how you organize services and providers and all that kind of stuff. React as a community seems a lot less prescriptive than that. I mean, React itself is really, it's a rendering engine. And now with hooks, I mean, it's a basic state and rendering engine, that's it. Not all that other stuff. So you bring that with you, which is both a curse and a blessing. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, so the only other thing I wanted to show you whenever we go to our character form is the reason why I created this complete form is you probably noticed whenever we submitted something, all the text stayed there. All you got to do to solve that is you just go set name and set image URL. And that's actually going to solve your problem for you. It'll be cleared out whenever you load it. Okay. This actually covers most of everything I wanted to cover. There's only two small things, and I will go ahead and do those now. How would you show, all right, here's the first question. How would you show whenever you click the load data button? How would you show that something's actually happening? Because right now it just looks slow, all right? How would you do that? Well, it's pretty easy, and this gets us into showing conditional rendering, which is something I wanted to show you. So let's say, once again, we have our load data out here up into the higher component. Ignoring for right now that we have our stuff spread around, you can totally do this. So now we have this idea of whether the data is currently in the process of loading or not. It is by default false. So I'm going to pass this into here. Okay. Once again, why do we have squigglies? We have squigglies because what we have to do is we have to specify in the props that we can get that. And that's all we have to do. And now we can use it. So let's use it. So how would you do conditional rendering? Sometimes you're going to show something on the screen, sometimes you're not. There's multiple ways. I'm going to show you one. If you put an undefined value into the React DOM like this, it's fine. It actually doesn't render anything. And it also doesn't give you an error. It's actually totally fine with this. What this means is you could also do this. So now, if that is ever true, it's going to actually assign this bit of DOM to that, and so it'll show up, right? So it's not going to show anything now because we actually aren't changing the state yet to show that. So let's just do that, and then I've shown you conditional rendering. So set is loading as our function. So whenever we call to load the data, we just say this to true. And I'll just leave it at that, and so we'll see a problem pretty quickly. And so when we hit load data, it'll show, yo, the data is loading immediately. And then the data comes in. But we also see, oh, wait, it's still there. So you just turn it off when it's done. It is loading. Data comes in, that disappears. And that's the basics of conditional rendering, which really is super easy. There's other patterns for people doing it, but this is easy enough. This also allows you to, even within the component, to pull some of the logic out of that block of DOM at the bottom and move it up a little bit. What you could also do in this case is you could actually just create a loading message component that just takes that Boolean, and then you've now removed that even out of here, and it is just an import of the component, and you just include it in the DOM. That would also work as well. I say that very abstractly just because we are running out of time. Let me do the last thing, and then I'll stop, ask questions, and if anybody wants me to implement anything else, we'll do it. And that is what happens if we want to load the data as soon as we get to the page, all right? And get to the thing of why in the world did I do this button on click thing? Why don't we just do this? The reason why we don't do this is because this is very bad. Whoa, what do you mean? Let's refresh again. Whoa, what do you mean? Well, see all these characters that keep getting re-rendered? All right, why is that happening? Take in your mind, what causes a re-render? All right, if you know the answer to this, we see the problem. We just don't, the solution is not obvious. I totally had to look at that.
Keep changing the state.
We're changing the state, right? So we call load data. We set state now in 2 places, which immediately calls it to re-render. And re-rendering means running this function again, which calls to load the data. And so we get in an endless loop. That's exactly the problem. So how do we solve this problem? Well, it's simple, but makes us talk about something that is going to probably require you to do some more playing around with. At first, this was really confusing to me. But once I started getting into use effect, it is a pattern you end up doing a lot, or at least I end up doing a lot when I'm writing React. And that is this. So this is not the solution. This is just part of the way to the solution. What this does is this, instead of immediately calling load the data, this turns it into a side effect. And so it still runs. And so it's just going to take longer. But if we look here, we can see that characters keeps getting called over and over and over again. All right, and it's for the same reason. It's just not happening as fast. So what do we do? And this is it right there. And we're going to see it work, and then I'm going to explain to you why it actually works. So we can see that this doesn't happen. Okay. So what is this? Use effect takes an optional parameter as the second parameter. And what you do is you can pass in any sort of object or array into that second parameter. And the neat thing about that is you can basically take something from state, all right? Which is not what we need to do in this particular case at all. But you could take something in state, put it there, and say, only do this side effect if this particular piece of state is what changed. You can also cram multiple things in, which means you can control side effects to where they will only fire when a number of different things have all changed. And so it's a really good way of controlling re-renders and controlling various things in your application. It is, from what I can see, the accepted way of solving this. For essentially, if you want to load data on the initial render of a form, how do you do it and only do it once? That's actually on the React documentation. They have that in one of their callouts. And so it's really not obvious at all if you're looking at it from the outside. But it is a simple solution. So that's a gotcha that I just wanted to share with you. Okay, the other things that we're going to show you, if we had time, is we were going to do more styling, which really isn't necessary. That's just CSS. If you want to do more styling later, I'd love to do a presentation on CSS. I love CSS. I was also going to do conditional rendering for whenever the form submission was happening. So it would tell you that the submission is in process. And I think that pretty much covered everything that I was planning on covering tonight. Does anybody have any questions about what we've done, or any requests that I can't promise I can actually fulfill, but I can try? All right, I will take that as a no. Oh, wait. Well, you're welcome, Mike. Things have gotten easier. That is true. All right, I'll share this with you. Actually, I can just go to the web page and show you this. So there's a web page. I do various geeky things. Only some of them are programming. If you're interested, follow me on Twitter, subscribe to me on YouTube. I also blog about things. If you have any questions, you can email me at any time, eric.sowell@gmail.com. If you have any questions for the user group, you can email all of us, because we all get this, officers@northdallas.net. That's officers@northdallas.net. If you've got any ideas for presenters, if you would like to present and do one of our remote sessions, because who knows when we're getting back together. If you just have thoughts, if you have requests of, man, I'd love to hear this particular topic, then send it to officers@northdallas.net. Or you can send it to me and I'll just pass it on to them. That's all good. Thanks for coming. Thanks for those of you who asked questions in either the chat or in speaking to me. I appreciate coming and I appreciate your attention. Any last questions, thoughts? Officers, any last announcements any of you want to make?
If anyone has any comments or suggestions about anything in our virtual sessions that you think you'd like to see if we can improve or do better, do different, again, this is something else for you to shoot us an email as well. Let us know. We can't hang around after the meeting. Well, I guess we could hang around after the meeting and have people talk to us virtually here, but it's a little bit different. But if there is something you'd like to talk to us about, please feel free to hit us up. And my apologies on the pizza delivery. We'll see what we can do for next time.
Dude.
Mike is actually just waiting for us to get wings after the meeting, which we're probably not going to do either.
Wait, what?
But
That's the only
Wait,
reason I
what?
come to this thing is to go get Wings After. What are you talking about? I'm already at Wingstop. I thought you were meeting me here.
I
Hey, will
see.
you give me some Louisiana rub?
No,
What?
it's your own wings.
Yeah, fine.
Where's the
All
source
right.
code?
Well,
Where's the source code? Oh, fantastic. Let me share my screen. Okay. It is going to be, if you go to github.com, tell you what, I will do I have this really large repo where I put lots of presentation code. There's going to be a folder down here that says 2020 7/1, I think. It is July, isn't it? Yeah. It's going to have the source code in there, and that will include both the extremely beautiful sample API and the extremely beautiful UI app. I'll get that pushed in the next 10, 15 minutes. And so that's Malioc. That's my gaming/Twitter handle / presentations. And I'll just stick that in the Slack channel and on the website. So you can all access it. You know where it is. The video will be on our Slack YouTube channel. David, are we going to put a link to that? Usually, is that what we do?
yeah, we usually update the website